congratulations to somebody that got this thing going. We sure seem to have a lot of trouble with it.
Higher on your coat. That's higher. Way up.
There you go.
There?
That's pretty good.
Is that pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't need to introduce myself. Sam already did that. So, thank you, Sammy. He mentioned my interest in native wildflowers over the years, and I got caught by that bug back in about 1989 or 90 somewhere. And I'm supposed to introduce myself first. I'm Jim Peterson. I've been a member here for 39 years. That's half of my life. So, anyway, and I'm a local guy. I grew up on the Purdue University Horticulture Farm out west of town. Went to Klondike School for 12 years and Purdue for 4 years. They're all local. And then I started doing other things. I traveled around with Ralston Purina for about 6 years. Then I came back to Lafayette and became a stockbroker for a couple of years, a stock and commodity broker. And then I joined the Lafayette National Bank, and I spent 31 years there as a trust investment officer. Anyway, I have 4 kids that are scattered all over the country. Matter of fact, my youngest is 51, just retired. From Eastman Chemical Company. He's just floating around now. Can't get that kid to work. Okay. As I said, my interest in plants, I got bit by the bug, like I said, about 1889 or 1989 or 1989. I started reading my notes about my talk today. But anyway, as a part of that, they talk about the edible plants and the plants that are harmful to you and all of that. And I finally kind of got interested in that. And then from that, I kind of backed into what the old settlers did with those plants. And it's really quite interesting because there are so many of them that they put to so many different uses that it's, really unbelievable. And when they came in, they started coming in, our European settlers, called Americans now, I guess, started coming in when the French owned this territory, which they did up until 1763. And then for about 20 years, the English ran the show, and then it was ceded to the United States in about 1793, and that was the Northwest Territory, which included about a 6 or 7 state area from Minnesota all the way down to Ohio, and that whole upper area through there, down to the Ohio River. And so the interest in the time that I got into is when I started, about when the French left. And at that time, now this is something to think about, the Indians were here. They were a tribal, or a hunter and gatherer society for the most part, even though they had a little bit of agriculture, but it really wasn't too much. But they had, the corn and the squash and the beans, and you've heard that story before, how they could plant 3 of them together and let the vine crawl up the corn for the beans, and the squash would be down there and shade the ground, and that would help everything grew better. They were smart enough to know that. And they knew enough about getting certain things in there to fertilize their crops. But of course, it was more or less of a garden rather than a field of crops. But they did well with it. And so, anyway, from about the curve on the number of Indians went clear down almost to nothing by 1838 or so, when we had our little Trail of Tears here, which wasn't as big as the one from the Cherokee Nation down south. But anyway, the number of Indians just went downhill, and whereas the number of white settlers started coming in, and it started going uphill. And I got the numbers to cover that here in a minute. But anyway, people, and the early people had to learn how to use what was here. They didn't have anything. When they came in, a lot of them came in on maybe horseback or not even that. They, you know, pulling an old cart, and all they could get in a little two-wheel cart about so wide is all they had. And maybe they'd have a hoe and the, you know, the necessary tools that they had to have, like an axe, and they didn't have much else. But anyway, they learned how to use some of these native plants, and I'm just going to go through a couple of them here, like spring beauty. That's a pretty little plant you see out there in the woodland in the spring. Nice little plant. Well, if you dig those up by the hundreds, you can get some good early food because they have a little tiny, like a potato, but you got to dig up an awful lot of them. And they're very nutritious, and they do well. They brought some seeds along with them. Some were good, some were bad. Dandelion, you know, that made a nice green early salad in the spring, and so they like the dandelions. They also can make some good fire water out of it. Garlic mustard was brought in, and it was reported as early as 1838 in the print in New York that it was there, and it was a great green. I know I have it every spring. It's great. I go out and pick it, and it's not hard to find, that's for sure. It's in the woods, and it makes a good salad early, but it's a terrible pest because it grows up. It's a biennial, which means that the seed sprouts one year and the plant gets so big and develops a good root, and then the second year, why, the plant shoots up about up to 4 feet high and blooms and has its seeds, but it can grow so fast that it shades all the other plants, and our spring woods gradually disappears if garlic mustard just takes over. So it's really become a pest, and we spend a lot of time getting rid of that now. I forgot to set my timer. See what okay. The garlic mustard is just a plant that really has caused a lot of trouble, and some of the state parks, they'll have volunteer days where they have 300 or 400 people come out and pull that stuff and get rid of it. We got rid of it all at the Clay Garden because I went down, and thanks to Laura, we had a lot of community kids that are community, what am I trying to say?
Correction.
Yeah. Anyway, kids that had to, community corrections, they had to serve time doing some kind of work for the county or any charitable organization. And I had them pulling garlic mustard. And we'd spread out about 5 feet apart at the bottom of a big hill, and they'd go up and pull the garlic mustard out. Another plant which I brought here is called a white snakeroot. I talked about this here when I gave the talk on the flowers about 4 or 5 years ago, but we got a lot of new members, and I know you old members remember every word of what I said. But this plant changed the course of history in our country, and it really did. It grows at the edge of the woods, only there. It doesn't grow out in the open prairies or anything like that, and it doesn't grow in the deep woods. It's just where there's open areas in the woods where it gets mottled or dappled sunshine will this plant grow. It is a plant that cattle like, and they come and nibble on the leaves, but they like other plants better, so it only pops up and is eaten, every couple of years or so, whenever the conditions are right, that other plants don't do as well. This one really grows. And the cattle, after they eat it, there's a chemical in it called termitol. And this termitol accumulates in the milk of the cattle, or the cows. And so when anybody drinks the milk, they get that concentrated termitol. And like I say, it doesn't happen every year. It just depends on what years. But when the cattle eat it, it happens. And they will get sick of this. And do you all remember the story about Nancy Hanks Lincoln died of milk sickness? It was due to this plant right here. And when I visited down there, I noticed quite a bit of it growing around where Lincoln supposedly lived at the state park. So it's really got a history. Well, what happens then, of course, after old Tom Lincoln came in and started farming there, his little clearings, you know, why he opened up some space, and that allowed this plant to grow. So they had their trouble, and so they came when Abe was a young boy, and I think it was only about 3 or 4 years before she died of it, and old Tom Lincoln didn't know what caused it, and nobody did then. It was a scourge of the white settlers, especially in this country. They couldn't handle it. It was too bad. So anyway, he moved out to Springfield, Illinois, which was out in a wide open prairie area down there, and got away from whatever was causing the fever, and they didn't know. And they didn't really figure it out until about 1860. So they spent all of their years when the people were coming in rapidly, what the heck caused it? And they didn't really know, and it killed an awful lot of the settlers when they came in here, probably more than what the Indians did. So anyway, what would have happened then if old Abe would have stayed in southern Indiana instead of being forced out to central Illinois? Why, you know, he might have just been a local storekeeper and never amounted to anything more than that. But as it was, he, of course, you know the rest of the story. Like I said, the French were here until about 1763. They came in, they were the pioneers really, way back as far as 16-something, and started making their settlements, and they started trading with the Indians. And there were a lot of Indians at the beginning. And this was primarily in southern Indiana. In northern Indiana, they never came in here near as quick. It was much, much later. So anyway, in southern Indiana, why, the French had developed a pretty good trading system with them, and they traded, you know, guns and a lot of things that the Indians could use for beaver pelts especially, plus other skins that the Indians could go out and collect, and that's what they did. They traded. Well, of course, the French also had fire water, as they called it. It was rum that they brought in, or whatever it was, or dandelion good stuff, or whatever. But they could always make a much better deal trading with the Indians in. The Indians are happier to trade and get much less. And so they cheated the Indians, so to speak, for many years. Then in 1763, when the English took over the territory, it was ceded to the English because of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Why, the Indians, of course, started adapting to the English. But what happened, though, was the fact that when the French first came, they brought diseases with them, especially smallpox. And the Indians started having trouble with that because they had no resistance whatsoever. And so they all started dying off. But it picked up until about the year 1800. And at that time, I got it here somewhere. Yeah, at that time, they estimate that there were about 2,600 Indians from a census there's 2,600 white folks is all in 1800. Then they started coming in very rapidly. In 1810, there's 24,000. In 1820, 147,000. 1830, 343,000. 1840, 685, and it goes right on up to 1990. There was over 2 million. Yeah, 2 million in here by 1890. And Indiana had that many, but Tippecanoe County in 2010 had only 172,000. Now, whoever took these recordings must have not traveled down Creasy Lane, or because that number's awful small. But anyway, the large Miami Nation was the predominant Indian tribe here at the time. Now remember, these are all tribes. They're all really primitive aborigines. They really didn't have any education or anything like we have at all. They just knew how to live off the woods, and when a society like that, you get a bunch of little tribes, and they would fight each other, and you know, they, like the ancient Europeans did, they say, when they come in there, especially in England, and they have one tribe that would raise, or what they called shires. They'd go and rob the women from the neighboring shire, because I don't know how they know it. Maybe you could tell me, but somehow they know that inbreeding isn't good. And they would bring in new blood or new DNA, they didn't know about DNA, of course, into their area, and they lived. So anyway, what we had there then, about 1800, was this big decimated Indian nation, and they estimate there's only about 5 or 10% of them left. Now, it's hard to believe, but when that disease ran rampant through the state, or the Northwest Territory at the time, Indiana Territory was named in 1800 when it was carved away from Ohio. Ohio became their own territory, and Indiana, which was the Northwest Territory divided in two, was separated out, and so the Indiana was the name of that. Well, Indiana, of course, was carved out in 1816 when it became a state. Now, those people that were here, the original settlers, you got to stop and think about what they might have had. They didn't have, no electricity. Just stop and think. You go out in a shed somewhere, an old shed, and sit in there at night. It gets dark in the winter, about 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, stay in there till late the next morning, and that was their life. As a matter of fact, the Americans found out that the way the Indians lived, that when they were going to have a battle, they would hold off attacking. They would let them know that they were coming in a certain day, so then the Indians, they'd get all ready. But it was the Indians' habit not to fight that much in the winter, because, as they were called, half-naked savages, and but it was their land. You got to remember that. It was their land to start with, although they didn't have any papers that said so. That was their big problem. But anyway, the Americans, especially at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in northeast Ohio, why the General Mad Anthony Wayne let them know that they were going to attack them, and so they gave him a date and everything. Well, then he didn't come that date. And the Indians sat there and waited, and finally some of them left. They say there were about 2,500 of them, and 500 of them took off to find food. And the reason they were going to find food is because they did not have a lot of food with them. They were ready to go. Well, then they got hungry, and over 3 days, Mad Anthony Wayne waited them out, and then they went in, and in 2 hours they took over the whole area. And the Battle of Fallen Timbers is where a big storm went through and laid all the trees down flat, and the Indians figured they wanted to fight there because they figured the white man couldn't fight very well because of the way he advances, one group, and there's all these trees here in their way. But it didn't work out for the poor Indians at all. The thing that surprised me about a lot of this was the law. They had so many, well, it was 600 years after the Magna Carta, and here we are, all these white folks coming in. And we had constables and sheriffs and had prosecuting attorneys and I don't know what all. and judges. And yeah, back then they had circuit court judges where circuit meant they traveled around different areas. So Laura, I think you probably have to get on your horse and ride to Connersville or something now, if you were alive back then. But they were traveled all over, the same way with preachers. They had the different religions traveled all around, and they had a big circuit. Matter of fact, the circuit ran all the way from Green Bay, Wisconsin to the Ohio River, the whole Northwest Territory. So that was quite a few people. So the battles with the Indians I'll get into more later, but anyway, they had a lot of trouble because the English, I remember they had the territory from 1783 up until they ceded it to the United States. And that during that time, why the Indians tried to get rid of the white settlers. And the King of England even declared that the settlers should not move west, because that's where a lot of the white people came from to start with, were the people who had already established themselves on the East Coast, and then they had to start moving west when the colonies started to form and started to take form. But all of this is slow and over several years and all that. Nothing ever happens fast. But as they came west, why, then they had to, the Indians came west, they had to find a place to live, and here it was already other tribes here. Well, the Big Miami tribe graciously allowed a lot of them to live in southern Indiana because they lived in the northern part, plus all the way into Ohio and Illinois. And so the 4 tribes came over that were, find out which ones they were. Anyway, I remember one of them was the Kickapoo, which I always thought was a rather strange name. It's a game we used to play as kids. Pasture. Come on. Yeah. And when the settlers first started coming in, why, the let's think, you got to build a log cabin, and all you got maybe is an old axe. You got to build an outhouse, and that's a whole story in itself. I mean, at first it was just 2 slats sideways over 2 stumps, and then the outhouse finally gradually became built. But if you just had an axe, it'd be awful hard to get a good smooth seat and all of that. It wasn't big enough. Janet knows this one. But with their English that they had, which came out of that era, and they really were very well educated. And they had, a few people who were very well educated, and then they had a lot of people that didn't have any education at all. But the one thing that came out of that era was there was a man named Ian McBride, whose son went to the privy and fell in the left side. Then along came his brother and fell into the other, and now they're interred side by side. All of this happened too during the time that we had the little ice age. And remember the year of 1816 when Indiana became a state, why the ice age was here, and it was pretty tough. They say that the things froze in July that year. Another thing that happened when I had the red man's curve going down and the white man's going up was that our native wild animals really started disappearing. And the first ones, and this is a list of those that were last seen in the state. In 1830 was the elk. 1830 was the bison. In 1832 was the lynx. in 1832 was the red wolf, and that was one of three kinds of wolves that were here, according to our local Journal and Courier man who wrote a book in 1860, The History of Tippecanoe County, Sanford Cox, which is a very interesting book. But he said that we had wolf hunts here, and they go out after the three wolves that we had in the area, which was the red wolf, the prairie wolf, which is our coyote, and the timber wolf, which was, of course, pushed a lot further north. But the red wolf is virtually extirpated now, There's a colony of them in the Carolinas, and there's quite a few of them yet in northern Mexico. The black rat was last seen in 1845, the black bear in 1850, the mountain lion in 1851, and boy, I've got a lot of mountain lion stories too, but I won't have time for them. The wolverine was 1852, the fisher is 1859, the gray wolf, as they called it, 1908, the timber wolf, porcupine, 1918, eastern spotted skunk, 1920, the river otter, 1942, and then the prairie chicken is 1972. The prairie chicken is one that my grandpa was born out west of Dunnington, Indiana, right on the Illinois border in 1870. And he said when he was growing up, which would be in the 80s mostly, why he said that they never went hungry. They could always go out and shoot a prairie chicken. And they'd fly up, and then they were enough of them that they'd blacken the sky and all of that. Well then, to show how they disappeared, our old buddy Paul Weigel used to sit over there about where Jan is now. He was born south of Green Hill, and in the 20s, he was a boy about 10. He was born in 1910. And in the 20s, when he'd be out and about, as young boys are to do, why, he said every once in a while he'd see those prairie chickens, and he said there may be 5 or 10 of them fly over, which was greatly reduced from what it was just a few years earlier in close to the same area. And so it just shows you how those things can disappear. The organized hunts they had, they'd have rattlesnake hunts, and we still have rattlers, that's why I didn't mention it. How much time was that?
You have about 7 minutes.
Okay. They had organized hunts where they go out with the shovels that they had and sticks, and we're talking about back in the 1830s and 40s now, to get rid of all these things that messed their life up. And they'd get the rattlesnakes and hunt them, and they'd poke in the ground, they talked about in the holes and all of that, and do whatever they could do and get rid of rattlesnakes. And they form big squares and then close in on the wolves and kill them if they could. And that were things they had to do in their spare time, as if they never had any. The spare time they had was pretty well taken up in the dark by using fireplace and candles, and that's about all they had, and playing games with the kids. And they developed all of that to a pretty high degree with all of our nursery rhymes and Grimm's fairy tales, which was written in 1812, and that kept the kids all entertained, and they would like that. And one of them was a song that came from Old England, where this fellow put on a show, and he had the band play the La Tempête and other crazy names, but one of them was Pop Goes the Weasel, which we think is just another children's nursery rhyme, but it's pretty neat. It's all around the cobbler's bench, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought it was all in fun, then pop goes the weasel. But when they do that, the kids are jumping, laughing, had a good old time. And that was entertainment in 1820 or 30. They didn't have these nice little telephones that everybody wears their thumbs out now. Then he wears about 20 verses to that Pop Goes the Weasel, and that's just one of them. And then a lot of the nursery rhymes that we had, I remember being read to me as a kid, you know. It gets kids interested in reading and so forth. The, let's see. Another thing we had going on back then was people would come in, roving guys, and they would capture Negroes. Now, we didn't have an official slavery state. We were against it, and so people that came here that had slaves would bring them with them, and they would either give them their freedom, and the slaves would stay with him, where else were they going to go? Or something like that. And we had an awful time with crooks coming around and stealing the slaves, taking them back down south, and selling them for a pretty good price. So this whole period of time is unbelievable. It's French fighting English, certain bands of Indians fighting French, fighting English, fighting the Americans, fighting each other. It's just fight, fight, fight. And I don't know, I guess that's the way you get out of a tribal community or a hunter and gatherer system, because they really couldn't, you know, do anything else. They'd fight and fight. Well, finally, about 1930, like I mentioned, our population really began to pick up, really about 1920, pick up when Indiana became a state. And then a lot of other people would come to it because it was a state then, and there were certain rules and regulations and all of that that they would felt safer with. So let's see. About 2 minutes. About it? Okay. That's a good place to quit. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. I had it over here and didn't see it. This plant here is one that the pioneers used to make string out of. And this stem, after this plant dries in the fall, if you cut it off and soak it in water, the outside will come off, and then you got left real nice long fibers. Now, the fibers weren't near as good as linen or sheep's wool or anything, but the linen is a plant that grows more far north here yet, more out of Canada. Matter of fact, Canada is the leading supplier, exporter of linen, and that was very important back to the pioneers.
Jim, what is that?
Yeah, what's it called?
This is called dogbane. And why it's dogbane, I never could find out. But it's just starting to come out now, the blooms. And it'll have blooms, and then it'll have pods, about that long, almost like a catalpa pod. And it has a lot of those on it. But it's an interesting plant.
We have people here that we can certainly ask about. The plant that they're talking about, and somebody else would probably know the name of it, the one that looks like a really large St. Anne's lace or whatever, but it can grow to 4 feet tall, and if you touch it,
Yeah.
What is that?
That grows around the Queen Anne's lace.
Well, it's not a Queen Anne's lace, but it looks like
Poison.
oh, it's something like that, and it grows, and you can be 4 feet tall, and if you touch it,
Oh,
you get something from it.
that's poison hemlock.
Okay.
Poison hemlock is what killed King Solomon, they say. And, you know, I guess it's in Europe too. I don't know if it's there or here, but it's sure here.
And
I
all
think
along the roads.
Yeah, all along the railroads and all of that. It's real thick, and it gets up 5 or 6 feet tall, and it's poisonous. So don't make a salad.
I don't know whether it was through email or something, but or Facebook that people were sending things about, and you would look at it. It was pretty, but you'd see somebody standing next to a plant that was 2 feet taller than it. Apparently has some sun synergy or something. If you get it on and you get in the sun, that it does bad things to you.